Okay, this is a test of the recording feature on Doceri Desktop. So I'm just going to start doing some of it and see what happens. All right. First I'm going to load the slides. I don't know if this microphone is going to be powerful enough, so that's what we want to find out. Where's the stylus? Where is the stylus? Writing on the slide. Okay, let's erase that. Clear all strokes. Okay. And let's turn that off. We'll get out of drawing mode here. Get to the right screen. So I can do it more quickly on here. All right. Yep, still waiting. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead. This is a review of, actually this is the material covered on Friday, 9/25/15, which would have been the Friday that some of you were not able to come in or didn't come in because of the Pope's visit. And this material will be covered on the exam on Wednesday. I'm going to start out with reviewing some material that we already went over, a few slides, and then go right into the discussion of how Thomas Aquinas says we're able to speak of God, and on to Sallie McFague's metaphorical discussion of God talk, which was the material that you were to read for today's class, okay, or that is for Friday's class. All right, so we've already been over this, metaphors, analogies, and indirect speech, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through all of this material because we have already been over it and we've already talked about Thomas. So I'm going to skip all through here, but you can pull these slides up, of course, by going into Blackboard. Okay, remember we're in Doctrine of God here. Okay, so just to review, Thomas says that we can know something of God, and humans not only can know that, but are able to speak about it. Yet there is a vast difference between God and humans. We said that's the typical position of Christian theism, that God is beyond the world, but is in relationship with it. Okay. In particular, there's a relationship between God and human beings called the Imago Dei. Remember, we said that was Latin for image of God. Thomas believes that this relationship is what makes us able to speak about God, and of course makes us different, therefore, than all other creators. Thomas both says that we cannot speak of God by using human language, because human language is inadequate for speaking of God. God is so much more than we are, yet we can speak of God. So, which one is it? Thomas is going to argue that the answer is both. And this is where we were on Wednesday, the previous Wednesday, which would have been 9/23, before we ran out of time. We had discussed already this idea from Thomas. These aren't direct quotes, but this is, again, his idea, that God is Father. We're pretty familiar with that language, and we talked in class. You guys gave me some great examples of why we would use that particular idea or relationship that human beings have to talk about God. We said that fathers are breadwinners. They provide, that they're strong, and they protect, that they're creators in the sense that we all have a biological father. Fathers can also be nurturing and caring. They offer both punishment, judgment, and forgiveness. So there were a variety of ways in which you said, I think quite correctly, that the word Father or the name Father is a good way to describe the Christian understanding of God. We also talked in class about Thomas's idea that God is not Father. Now, he just told us that God is Father, but he says that God is not Father. All right. Again, in class, you guys gave some great answers. You said that God is not Father, which means, among other things, God is not our biological father. He's not literally our father in that sense. That God is much more than a father, that we wouldn't want to limit what we're saying to one word. Father does not capture all that God is, even though it is a useful word. And then this is where we left off. I said I was going to ask you the question when we came back on Friday the 25th. What you think this idea from Thomas means, that God is not Father. Now, in the class, the folks that were there on Friday, the 25th, some of the answers I got were that even though we aren't able to literally say that God is Father, and that Father is not an adequate term to fully describe what God is like, including what our relationship with God is like, that does not mean that using the term Father is not a useful and helpful way to speak of God, an accurate way of speaking of God, as long as we are aware that it's only partial, and that it does not capture all of God, but that instead it's a human approximation of our understanding of God. Okay? So from there, let's move on to the next material. Okay? Thomas then goes on, and this is in the piece that I asked you to read from Thomas Aquinas on God Talk. He gives us 3 types of descriptive language, okay? The first is, it's pronounced univocal, but you can just see it's just a prefix uni, which means one or single, as you know, and vocal, which has to do with speech or speaking. And so it's univocal. Univocal language is language in which, for example, a single word refers to 2 things, but those things are pretty much the same, okay? So just to give an example of that, here's some little fruit bats. They're kind of cute, if you like fruit bats. So the word we're looking at here is bat. Here's another bat, not so cute, a vampire bat, but they're both, animals, pretty much related to each other. They're very close in terms of species and so forth and so on. So this is an example of a univocal usage. The same word, bat, used to refer to 2 things that are pretty much the same, okay? A single usage. Now, let's compare that to a second kind of descriptive language, which Thomas calls equivocal. So it's equi, and then vocal, all right? Many. And an equivocal usage, or an equivocal type of descriptive language, is when a single word refers to at least 2 things, or perhaps more than 2 things, that are quite different from each other. I don't know if they teach this anymore in terms of how this is taught when you learn reading and grammar. We used to call these heteronyms, and univocal language is homonyms. Again, I'm not sure you're familiar with that term, but if you are, that's what this means. Equivocal would be language words that are heteronyms. So, for example, here's our bats again. Now, really, aren't they cute? Okay, and we know they're going to grow up to be not so cute, but they're pretty cute there. So we have our bats again, but this time we have another use of the word bat. In this case, baseball bat. So the word bat here is used in an equivocal way. We've got 2 things, same word, different meanings, all right? Now, Thomas is going to tell us that language for God is neither univocal. In other words, a word we would use for God is not exactly the same as human experience, but it is also not entirely different. All right, and so it's just got this in-between quality, all right? It's not the same, but it's not different. It's somewhere in the middle or somewhere in between. It's kind of fuzzy, all right? The word he uses for this kind of descriptive language, in this case, language to describe God, is analogical, all right? I'm sure you're familiar with the word analogy, all right? So similar to that. A word that refers to things that are neither the same nor exact or completely different, but there is some relationship, okay? It lives somewhere in between. Now, he actually gives some examples in the piece that I asked you to read. I'm going to use this one instead of the one about urine. That's not too pleasant to talk about, all right? So let's talk about diet instead, all right? He uses this to try and explain what he means by this idea of analogical language. Here we have a picture of a healthy plate, okay, and which has replaced the food pyramid, which you guys may have seen when you were younger, to describe what one should eat. This diet is said to be healthy, but the diet itself doesn't have health. It's called a healthy diet because it would cause health, all right? In other words, if you eat it, the idea is that then you would be healthy, all right? So it's a healthy diet because of the results that it produces, okay? Now, we can use the same word health or healthy here, but so it will be related to the idea of a healthy diet, but the use is also a little bit different, all right? So here we have some great-looking kids here who are healthy kids, all right? Now, in this case, it's not that the kids cause health or produce health. It's that they are healthy. They have health. It's an essential quality of them, which might be caused by eating a healthy diet. So we have this same word, healthy. The meaning is not entirely the same. It's not univocal. It's not absolutely different, so it's not equivocal. Thomas would say that that usage is analogical, all right? We can see the same thing here with this kind of usage. Thomas says to us that all God language, and that means all language we use as humans to talk about God, is analogical. If we look at the idea of God and love, Thomas would say humans can love, all right? And we can speak of love as a quality of God, all right? Why is that? For 3 reasons, he would say. 1, because God is love. Remember, we talked about God language as language of perfection, all right? And we looked at, we mentioned that when we looked at Thomas's 5 arguments or 5 ways for arguing the existence of God. Number 4 was the argument for perfection. God is the most perfect form, or the highest form of any good quality. And we measure or are able to see different degrees of our own behavior, in this case, or our own quality of that by measuring it against the perfection of God. So God is not only someone who has love or loves us, but is love. He is the essence of love. Okay? God also makes it possible for us to love. In other words, the source of human love, or the ability of humans to love, Christianity would say, is God. So we see this is similar to what we saw with healthy diet, healthy children. And then thirdly, a point that we made earlier, Thomas would say that we are able to talk about the love of God and to have love because we are made in the image of God. All right, so and that's the direct connection and what makes humans different from other creatures, according to Thomas. Okay, so all right. The next person we want to look at is a 20th century theologian. So we've looked at Thomas, who we've identified as in the 13th century. We're going to look at a 20th century theologian now named Sallie McFague, who uses talks about the idea of what she calls metaphorical theology. All right, so just briefly a little bit about her. This picture of Sallie here is probably fairly recent. She's a late 20th century theologian in terms of her major work. She's still working and teaching, but for many, many years she was on the faculty of the Vanderbilt Divinity School, the seminary at Vanderbilt University in Nashville until she retired. And so she's continuing to work and teach in a variety of places. But again, her major career was there at Vanderbilt. Her most important work is the book Models of God. And in that, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the ideas that are in that. But in that, basically, she spends the first part of the book talking about what she means by model. And a model is just a metaphor that has worked really well, so people use it a lot, okay? And then in the second part of the book, she conducts 3 thought experiments, and we'll talk a little bit more about those thought experiments in a minute. In other words, she says, okay, let's try some new metaphors for God, some new language for God, what Thomas would call some new analogies for God, and see what works about them, all right? What she does in the book is what I've asked you to do in a couple of your paper preparation exercises, which is she identifies a metaphor for God, a name for God, an idea about the qualities of God. She describes that, and then she says, well, okay, what works about this? Why, what parts of this make this, useful or a good way to speak about God? And then she, again, she's critiquing her own work now. We'll look at that same name and say, well, what doesn't work about this? Where does this fall short? Where does this hit the wall? Where does this stop working? What are the problems with this? So if you want to see somebody who is a good example of this kind of argument, which is basically what I'm asking you to do in your papers, then you could take a look at this particular book. All right. She wrote another book when she finished Models of God called Body of God, which was a spin-off from one of the models that's here in the first book, and I will tell you what those models are, what the thought experiments are in a minute, all right? But just to identify some key ideas that we're going to look at in her work, like Thomas, she says that all the ways in which we speak of God are indirect, all right? In other words, they're not, exactly on target because we don't have a direct experience of God. All our experiences of God are indirect. That is, they come through some other medium, maybe a relationship with a person, something we read, a homily we heard, just, taking a walk and thinking and you have an insight, all right, praying, receiving the Eucharist. There could be, there are endless ways in which one might experience God, but none of them are direct, all right? Someone else might not see that as an experience of God. If it was direct, it would be obvious to everyone, all right? So it's all indirect and incomplete. This is exactly the same thing that Thomas says. And then she goes a little further than Thomas. She says she wants particularly to look at 2 models for God, or 2 metaphors that have stuck or been around for a long time, and those are God the Father and God as a monarch or king. She says that to use only one metaphor is really to violate the first commandment. You'll remember the first commandment says, I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And McFague will argue that to limit our understandings or our language for God, our names for God, to just 1 or 2 is really to sort of turn those names into idols, to act as if somehow they are indispensable and no other names will do. And again, in the piece, she talks about why she thinks that's a problem. Then we see something really different. We definitely won't see this in Thomas. We see a criterion for judging whether or not, in this case, a name for God or a metaphor for God, or what Thomas would call an analogy for God, is a good one or not so good. And it's a criterion that is actually fairly unusual, but it's one that we see used by a group of theologians that are called liberation theologians. Sallie McFague works primarily in feminist theologies, which is a one form of liberation theologies. Liberation theologies are characterized by a variety of things, but primarily by the fact that they attend to the experiences and the voices of groups who have traditionally in theology been ignored. So that would certainly include women. It would include the very poor. It would include persons of color, particularly in the United States, but certainly not limited to that. Liberation theology emerged out of South Africa under apartheid, and from a variety of colonized communities across the globe. All right? What those theologies share, as we said, is that they attempt to speak from the voice of or on behalf of those who have been peripheral to the broader theological conversation, and they will judge whether or not what we say in theology, including what we say about God or what we call God, as adequate or inadequate based not on, number one, whether it's in the Bible. They certainly will look to the Bible as a source, but they will. That's not going to be their major criterion. They're not going to say if it's not in the Bible, it's no good. All right? They're going to set that aside. And they're also going to say the same thing about tradition. All right? In fact, one of their tasks is usually to critique the tradition because it has not paid attention to these other voices, which are usually voices characterized by some kind of suffering or oppression. Instead, McFague and others like her will say, if you want to figure out whether a theology is a good theology or a bad theology, look at the kind of results that it produces in the world. And what she means by that is that it's important that theology causes us to, or one of the tasks of theology is that it shapes the way we think about our world. Think of it as a sort of an ideology that's helpful. It shapes what we think the world should be like. And if it helps us to think of the world and work toward a world that is a better one for the vast majority, then that's probably a good use of theological language. But if it does not, if it benefits only the few, if it causes massive public suffering, or for a variety of other reasons, liberation theologians like McFague would reject that as adequate theology, even if that language is found in the tradition or in the scripture. So let's look at some of these ideas in a little bit more detail. All right, so like Thomas, some presuppositions. The first one we want to identify in McFague is that theology is a constructive enterprise, okay? That it's not the same thing as faith. It's not the same thing as our relationship with God. It is the way we try to talk about both of those things. And therefore, it's something that humans do. In a sense, we make it up, all right? That doesn't mean it's not true or that it doesn't contain truth, but it's a human construction. And because of that, it means it's always going to be partial, that it can sometimes be mistaken. The story I told in class was that my standard line when I get introduced to people at a party or some kind of social event sort of runs like this. People say, what do you do for a living? And I try to sort of avoid the question by saying, oh, well, I'm a teacher, and I hope they'll drop it at that, but they usually don't. And then the next thing they'll say is, well, where do you work? And I'll say, well, I teach at St. Joe. At the prep? No, at the university. And again, I'm hoping that will be the end of the conversation. But usually people persist and they will ask me, well, what do I teach? And it's at that point I wish I was in the history department or something. Because, well, let's just say, saying that you teach theologies sometimes viewed as a little strange. So I say, instead, I teach theology and make up stuff for a living. Which is kind of true, according to McFague, and also not true. All right, so theology is something that humans do. We create it out of our own experience, our own sense of experiences of God in the world. Okay? Secondly, that theology is always done with metaphors. McFague uses the word metaphor or metaphorical in this exactly same way that Thomas uses the idea of analogical language. Now, in class I asked how many English majors or other folks who worked in other kinds of literature there were in the class, and then I said to all of them, please bear with us, because in studying the English language, we're aware that there actually are differences between what we mean by an analogy, a metaphor, a simile, and so forth and so on. But that in the case of this work right here with McFague and with Thomas, they're not making those kinds of distinctions. They're just kind of lumping it all together, all right, as the ways in which we speak about God that are, shall we say, fuzzy around the edges, all right? So again, if you'll just bear with us there. So when she says that theology is done with metaphors, she means what Thomas means by analogical language, that God language is never sort of directly spot on. It's always indirect, derived from our indirect experience, and that it both does and does not capture something of what God is like for human beings. Okay? Therefore, another way of saying that is that theology is both art, that it's poetic language, all right, and that it's also philosophy, or you could say science, all right? And what I mean by that is that a theological argument, like the one you're going to make in your paper, should be logically sound, all right? One point should follow another. But always with the recognition that we never fully capture what it is that might be said about God. Or even if what we have is to say God is love. Well, there's nothing inaccurate or fuzzy about that at all, but that we can never really fully grasp the totality of that, all right? And that God is always more than other things in addition to whatever it is that we're naming. All right. And then lastly, and this goes back to what we just said about theological criteria, how we judge whether or not language is good or bad, is that theology has real implications in the world. In other words, McFague and many others will say, it matters what we say in theology. And it matters because it affects the way in which we live in the world and the way in which we try to either change the world, the direction that we go, or the ways in which we try to retain what we have. So, because it's about our ideal. She uses the word utopia at one point in a different place where she's talking about this idea of metaphorical language. And she says, yes, a utopia is a fantasy. There is no such thing as a perfect place. No utopia can ever come true. And so in that sense, utopias are often dismissed. But what she replies to that is, yes, all of that is true, but it's still important to have an idea of what one thinks utopia would be like. And that idea can be, evolving and changing. But you have an idea of what you think the best possible world would be. And that should and does have an effect on how you live in the world. And so therefore, she says, that's why it matters what we say in theology. And that's why we judge a good theology or a poor theology based on how it shapes the way we act in the world. Alrighty. So, her types of descriptive speech, she's going to really just use the one word metaphor. She says a metaphor is a word that's used inappropriately. Okay, it's used where where it shouldn't be used. One example she gives in another place is the arm of a chair. All right, she says chairs don't have arms. All right, but again, this is a way of trying to describe a part of a chair. They're sort of like arms, but they're not arms. So again, it's that idea of analogy, or what she calls metaphor. All right, she says if a metaphor is working, it will catch your attention. It will surprise you. It will make you think in ways that had not occurred to you. Here are a couple of examples. The sun is an orange. Okay, well, the sun is not an orange. It's not a piece of fruit. It's a ball of hot gases. But one might say this if one's trying to describe a particularly spectacular sunrise or sunset, perhaps, okay, and that it captures something that you can't capture by saying, the sun is an orange-colored ball of hot gases. Okay, it just kind of doesn't do the same thing. It doesn't create the same idea, the same sensation. Okay, one that'll be familiar to Harry Potter fans, Weasley is our king, which got sung by the Slytherins, the opposing team, at the Quidditch match in, I forget which book. I think it's number 3, but correct me if I'm wrong, where Ron goes out for the Quidditch team. He's not really a very confident player. He keeps missing goals, so the other side sings Weasley is our king, which of course is high irony or sarcasm because he is winning for the other team. Okay, so he's not any kind of king, until that language then gets turned on its head when he plays a fantastic final game. All right, then he is the king, but he's not really a king. He's not really a monarch. But instead, it's a word to sort of describe his performance. Okay, so there's nothing worse for a metaphor than to try and explain it. It really takes all the oomph out of it. So I apologize for that. She was on fire. All right, I have a book at home that says "Teach like your hair's on fire." Okay, I hope you've had a teacher at some time in your life who teaches like his or her hair is on fire. All right, I'm sure you know what that means. So I won't try to explain it. But again, a metaphor, not literal. Okay, a model, McFague says, as we said before, it's just a metaphor that's got staying power. So God the Father would be a good example of a model. In fact, she would say it is the primary model that we have used here in the church. Jesus the Good Shepherd, that would be another one. Jesus, of course, was literally not a shepherd. He was a tecton, some kind of craftsman. Okay, and we said God is and is not a father. All right. Metaphors as language for God. All right. If a metaphor is a word that is supposed to spark our imagination or surprise us, she raises the question of whether or not God the Father actually works anymore, all right, as a metaphor. In other words, is it worn out? Have we heard it so much that it's not surprising? In other words, if we hear that God is Father, she is suggesting that that should actually be amazing or striking or surprising to us, that we would use that kind of common language to speak about the divine, and that it would evoke certain ideas. We've heard it so much that pretty much we don't think about it at all. So one question she raises is that, does this even work anymore? Or do we need to come up with additional metaphors, new metaphors, to really capture the sense of God in the world, all right? We talked earlier about what is evoked by God as Father. When we talked about God is Father, God is not Father, God is not Father. God is monarch, so what is evoked there? Some of the things that got said in class on Friday were the idea of ruling, of controlling, also protecting, okay? But this very much a sort of top-down relationship, a relationship of superiority and inferiority, or domination and submission. And again, McFague raises the question of whether or not, even if this is a good image for a society that has this kind or this form of government, whether or not it's a good image for, number one, a society that is a democratic republic, where we strive somewhat unsuccessfully in a lot of ways, but nevertheless hold the idea that every citizen is equal to every other citizen, and whether or not it's an idea that contributes positively to a world where we're more and more interconnected. Okay, so again, she wants to question both of these metaphors for a couple of reasons, okay? And asks us, do these words still have the power to, do they function for us? Do they catch our imagination, or have they been used so much? Then she raises the question of whether or not, it's a problem that we've pretty much limited our language for God, for the most part, to these metaphors, okay? And she will talk about, again, about human relationships, about our relationships in the environment, and a variety of things to sort of raise this question. And she will return to this idea of an idolatrous relationship, that we have almost turned these terms, particularly God the Father, into an idol that blocks out the possibility of other kind of language for God. So this is what takes her to her thought experiment. All right. She says in the book Models of God, let's try out some new metaphors for God and just, again, see what works about them and what doesn't. So there are 3 that she identifies in the book Models of God. One is God as mother. All right. Now, in the Catholic tradition, of course, Mary is the mother figure, the mother of God, but she is not a divine figure at all in the Catholic tradition. Well, there are certain, shall we say, strands of the tradition where Mary is, shall we say, a co-creator or a co-redeemer, but those are fairly minor and have been rejected by the mainstream teaching, okay? We don't have God as a female figure in the Christian tradition, okay? Why is that, all right? Is there something about mothers that makes him not valuable enough or not important enough to use them as a way to speak about God? Okay, that's the question she wants to raise. On the other hand, she's very concerned that if we think about God as mother, as God having the qualities that we usually have traditionally associated with women, which is nurturing, caring, selflessness, obedience, those kinds of things. Probably not obedience in terms of God, but nevertheless, nurturing, kindness, lovingness. That what we've done is to reinforce the kinds of stereotypes we have about what men should be like and what women should be like that we've already had. And so she's very concerned not to do that, but instead to argue that both men and women, and therefore both images of God, can play all the various roles, but that because God created humans as male and female, and then she draws from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, and God created them, male and female, he created them in the image of God, he created them. That if the image of God is male and female, that we should include female metaphors as well as male metaphors for God. All right, so she tries that one out, looks at some pros and cons of that. Then the other 2 are even more provocative. One is God as lover, okay, and the other is God as friend. And then in another piece, she takes this idea that if God is mother, then God's creation is really a part of God's body in the way that a child comes from the body of the mother and in fact is part of the mother's body, and says, and sort of asks the question of, can we speak of the world as God's body? And if we did, would that change how we treat creation? So again, these are thought experiments. She's just trying these things out, and several of them I think probably do shock or surprise. God is lover, all right. God is friend. Can you be friends with the divine? All right. Some would definitely say yes. Others would say no. That doesn't work. So she's just trying these out and looking to see what might be useful about them and what is not helpful. So here are some additional questions. How do they function? What do they do? What ideas do we get when we think of God in those ways, ideas we might not have by using other metaphors, okay? So those questions are there. You can look at them. All right. That's the end. That takes us to the end of the session and the material we covered on Friday. On Monday, we will have been over, and probably by the time you listen to this, we will already have covered this next section where we're going to look at Henry McNeill Turner's newspaper editorial entitled God is a Negro. Okay? If you have questions about the material from last Friday or any of the other material before the exam, please let me know. Let me also say, and I'll announce this in class on Monday, but there's going to be a question and answer study session before the exam on Tuesday night on a little website called Neat Chat. It's very simple. About 10 or 15 minutes before 7 p.m. on Tuesday night, I'm going to send out an email that's going to have a link in it. And if you want to join the question and answer session, then all you have to do is click on the link. A box will open up on a new web tab, new web page, and ask you for your name. Please put your first and last name, because I've got several Natalies and this and that, several Joes, so I'll know who's who. No anonymous lurkers, please. You're welcome to lurk, but not anonymously. I do give extra credit, not extra credit, excuse me. I give participation credit for folks who ask questions during the Q&A session, okay? Again, strictly optional, but if you have questions or want to see what questions other folks are answering, you can log on during that time, and I'll also be posting the transcript on the Blackboard page when we're done. So that session will run from 7 to 8:30. All right? So I hope this is helpful for those who weren't able to attend class, or for those who wanted to use this to review the material. Okay? So I'll see you at the next class.